In this video, we're going to practice using the distributive property by performing the parentheses first, like we learned in the order of operations, and then by rewriting using the distributive property and evaluating the results. So we'll get to practice using the distributive property, and also we'll get to see that the results, in fact, are equal. So performing the parentheses first, I would have 5, 3 plus 4 is 7, so 5 times 7 is 35. Now I'm going to rewrite using the distributive property. Well, let me write this here first. We're going to multiply the 5 by the 3 and the 5 by the 4 and sum the results. So this will be 5 times 3 plus 5 times 4. Now we're going to find these products before we find the sum because we need to do multiplication first. 5 times 3 is 15, 5 times 4 is 20, and adding these two numbers together, 15 plus 20 equals 35. So our results do in fact match. Okay, and I know this way is longer, and you may not quite see a need for it yet, but it's really useful to develop this idea that these are in fact equal. Let's look at the next one. Well, if we do the parentheses first, 7 minus 5 is 2, and we'd have 3 times 2, which is 6. Now we'll use the distributive property, and I'm going to use the arrows again. I'm going to multiply 3 times 7, and then subtract 3 times 5. So 3 times 7 minus 3 times 5. So this is 21 minus 15, which is 6. And notice our results match. Okay. Let's look at the next one. So this one is going to be a little trickier. Okay. So first, when we perform the parentheses, 5 plus 2 is 7. So we have negative 4 times 7. So a negative times a positive is negative, and we multiply the absolute values. 4 times 7 is 28. Now let's see this with the distributive property. Now, the number up front is negative 4, so we need to multiply negative 4 times 5 and then add negative 4 times 2. So I'm going to put the negative 4 in parentheses. Negative 4 times 5 plus negative 4 times 2. Now let's multiply the pieces. Negative 4 times 5 is negative 20, plus negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Now adding these together, they're both negatives, so I add the absolute values and keep the negative sign. 20 plus 8 is 28, and the result is negative 28. And that checks with our other result. And finally, here we can think of this as the opposite of the quantity, 3 minus 7. You can also think of it as negative 1 times 3 minus 7. Okay. So let's look at this both ways. So first, using the parentheses, 3 minus 7 is negative 4. And now we have the opposite of negative 4, which is positive 4. Or if you had thought of this as a negative 1, it would be negative 1 times negative 4. Well, a negative times a negative is positive. Okay. So now for the distributive property, we're going to look at this in two ways also. I can think of distributing the opposite. So basically what that would mean is distributing the opposite to 3, so we would have the opposite of 3 minus the opposite of 7. Well, that would be negative 3. Subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. Negative 3 plus 7 is 4. So that's one way to think of this. Notice you're changing not just the 3, but you have to change the sign of everything in parentheses. These were both positive. I changed them both to negatives or their opposite. And also, if you want to think of distributing a -1, this will be -1 times 3 minus -1 times 7. Notice we get the same results. -1 times 3 is -3, minus -1 times 7 is -7, and subtracting a negative is the same as adding the opposite or adding a positive, which gives us 4. Okay? So 2 ways to think about this, thinking of taking the opposite of the terms inside, where this is +3 and this is +7, or distributing a -1, which is basically has the result of giving you the opposite.